May the 2nd, 1945, a muddy POW holding camp near the Elbe River, Germany. Corporal James Whitmore stood at the edge of the wire, watching 300 German prisoners shuffle through the morning roll call when he saw her fall. She went down hard, her knee buckling beneath her as if the bone had simply given up. The other prisoners moved around her like water around a stone, their eyes fixed forward, their faces blank with the careful emptiness of people who had learned not to draw attention. No one helped her. James watched the woman struggle to rise, her hands pressing into the mud, her face twisted with a pain she was trying desperately to hide. She was perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair matted with dirt, and a nurse's uniform that had once been white but was now the color of old dishwater. Her left leg dragged behind her at an angle that made James's stomach turn. The guard nearest to her, a private from Tennessee named Holloway, walked over and kicked mud in her direction. He told her to get up. He told her that German women did not deserve American sympathy. He told her that she could crawl to the medical tent if she wanted help, because he certainly was not going to carry her. James Whitmore had seen a lot of things in this war. He had seen friends die in his arms. He had seen villages burned to ash. He had seen the inside of a concentration camp and the walking skeletons who had somehow survived it. But something about this moment, about this woman lying in the mud, while an American soldier laughed at her suffering, broke something open inside him. He stepped through the gate, walked past Holloway without a word, and knelt down in the mud beside her. What he did next would divide the camp, nearly end his military career, and ultimately teach him the most important lesson of his life. In that moment, reaching down to help a woman who was supposed to be his enemy, James Whitmore had no idea that he was about to start a chain of events that would shake the entire camp to its foundation. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the complicated, painful, and deeply human moments that history often forgets. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and help us remember these stories together. Now, let us go back to the beginning to understand who James Whitmore was and why that moment in the mud changed everything. James Whitmore was born in the summer of 1920 in a small town called Cedar Falls in the rolling farmland of northeastern Iowa. His father, Robert, owned the only pharmacy in town, a narrow building on Main Street with a bell that jingled when customers came through the door, and shelves lined with brown glass bottles that seemed to contain the answers to every ailment known to man. James grew up behind that counter, watching his father mix compounds and fill prescriptions, listening to the conversations between Robert and the farmers and shopkeepers who came seeking relief from their various pains. His father had a way of talking to people that James would never forget, calm, patient, genuinely interested in their troubles. Robert Whitmore believed that every person who walked through his door deserved respect, regardless of whether they could pay their bill or not. During the Depression, he kept a ledger of accounts that he never collected on, and when James asked him why, his father had explained that medicine was not about money. It was about helping people who needed help. James absorbed this lesson without fully understanding it. He was a quiet boy, more comfortable with books than with the rough games that the other children played. He was good at school, particularly at science and mathematics, and everyone assumed he would follow his father into the pharmacy business. The war changed those assumptions. James was 21 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked, a junior at the University of Iowa studying pre-pharmacy. He remembered exactly where he was when he heard the news. In his dormitory room, reading a textbook on organic chemistry, when his roommate burst through the door with the radio turned up loud enough to hear down the hall. The voice of the announcer was tight with barely controlled emotion, describing the destruction in Hawaii, the ships burning in the harbor, the planes falling from the sky like broken birds. James set down his textbook and listened. He enlisted the next morning. His father was not surprised when James called to tell him Robert Whitmore had served in the First World War, had seen the trenches of France and the mud and the gas and the endless rows of graves. He knew what his son was getting into, but he also knew that some choices are not really choices at all. James trained as a medic. It seemed like the natural fit for a pharmacist's son, a way to serve his country, while staying true to the principles his father had taught him. He learned to bandage wounds, to administer morphine, to perform emergency procedures in conditions that would have horrified the professors at Iowa. He shipped out for Europe in the spring of 1944, assigned to an infantry division that would land on Utah Beach a few weeks after D-Day. The war that followed was nothing like the newsreels had suggested. James discovered that being a medic meant running toward the gunfire while everyone else ran away. It meant crawling through mud and blood to reach men who were screaming for their mothers. It meant making impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was already gone, sometimes with only seconds to decide. He learned to function in a state of controlled terror, to keep his hands steady while shells exploded around him, to speak in a calm voice, even when his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. And he learned something else, something that his father's pharmacy had not prepared him for. He learned that the enemy was human. The first German soldier James treated was a boy of perhaps 17, with a shrapnel wound in his stomach and eyes that were wide with fear. He had been left behind during a retreat, too wounded to move, and when James found him in a shattered farmhouse, the boy had raised his hands and said the only English word he knew, "Please." James treated him. He cleaned the wound, applied bandages, gave him water from his canteen. The boy survived long enough to be taken prisoner, and James never learned what happened to him after that, but he remembered the way the boy had looked at him. Not with hatred, not with defiance, just with the desperate hope of a wounded animal who wanted to live. That look stayed with James through the months that followed. It stayed with him through the hedgerow fighting and the push through France. It stayed with him through the frozen hell of the Ardennes and the crossing of the Rhine. It stayed with him as the German resistance crumbled and the war lurched toward its inevitable end. By the spring of 1945, James Whitmore had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, American and German alike. He had earned a Bronze Star for dragging 2 men out of a burning half-track. He had been promoted to corporal and recommended for a battlefield commission that he had declined. He was 24 years old, and he felt like he was 100. When his unit was assigned to help run a POW camp near the Elbe River, James thought the worst was behind him. The fighting was essentially over. The prisoners were mostly glad to be out of the war. All he had to do was provide basic medical care until the paperwork was processed and everyone could go home. He had no idea how wrong he was. The POW camp was a hastily constructed affair, a collection of tents and barbed wire thrown up on a muddy field that had probably been a farm before the war. By May of 1945, it held nearly 500 German prisoners, soldiers who had surrendered in the final collapse, civilians who had been swept up in the chaos, and a handful of women who had served in various auxiliary roles. The women were kept in a separate section of the camp, guarded primarily by soldiers who viewed the assignment as either an opportunity for abuse or a chance to avoid any remaining combat. The commanding officer, a captain named Morrison who seemed more interested in his own comfort than in the welfare of his prisoners, made it clear that the Germans were to be treated as defeated enemies, not as human beings deserving of respect. James did not like Captain Morrison. The man had never seen combat, had spent the war behind a desk in London, and had been given command of this camp as a political favor to someone with more rank than sense. He issued orders that made no practical sense and punished any soldier who questioned them. The medical tent was James's domain, a small patch of authority where he could operate according to his own principles. He treated American soldiers and German prisoners with equal care, and if anyone objected, he cited regulations about the treatment of POWs under the Geneva Convention. Most of the prisoners who came to him had minor complaints, cuts that needed cleaning, illnesses that required basic medication, the accumulated wear of months or years of insufficient food and rest. James handled them all with the same calm efficiency his father had shown behind the pharmacy counter. Then came the morning of May the 2nd. James had been awake since dawn, dealing with an American private who had gotten drunk the night before and fallen into a latrine ditch. The private was bruised and humiliated, but otherwise unharmed, and James had just finished cleaning him up when he heard the commotion from the main compound. He walked outside to see what was happening. The morning roll call was underway, the prisoners standing in their designated rows while guards moved among them, counting heads and checking papers. It was a routine procedure, boring and bureaucratic, and James was about to go back inside when movement caught his eye. A woman near the back of the formation was limping badly, each step clearly causing her pain. She was trying to keep up with the others, trying not to fall behind, but her left leg was barely supporting her weight. James watched as she stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again, and then she fell. The other prisoners moved around her immediately, their eyes fixed forward, their faces carefully blank. James had seen this behavior before. It was the survival instinct of people who had learned that drawing attention to yourself, or to others, only made things worse. The guard nearest to her was Private Holloway, a man James knew and did not like. Holloway was from a small town in Tennessee, the son of a preacher who had apparently failed to teach his son anything about compassion. He had a mean streak that he usually kept hidden from the officers, but let loose on the prisoners whenever he thought no one important was watching. Holloway walked over to the fallen woman and stood looking down at her. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that made James's stomach tighten. Holloway kicked mud at her, not at her directly, but close enough to splatter her face and uniform. He said something that James could not hear from this distance, but the tone was clear enough. The woman tried to rise. Her arms trembled with the effort and her left leg buckled again, sending her back down into the mud. Holloway laughed. James was moving before he consciously decided to move. He walked through the gate that separated the medical area from the main compound, past the guard who started to say something, and then thought better of it, past Holloway without acknowledging his existence. He knelt down in the mud beside the woman. She looked up at him with eyes that expected another blow. Her face was thin, hollow-cheeked from months of inadequate food, and beneath the mud, James could see the remnants of what had once been a nurse's uniform. He asked her, in the simple German he had learned during his months in Europe, where she was hurt. She stared at him for a long moment, as if she could not quite believe what she was seeing. Then she pointed to her left leg, just below the knee. James helped her to her feet, taking most of her weight on his shoulder. She was lighter than he expected, nothing but bones and determination beneath the dirty uniform. Holloway stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He demanded to know what James thought he was doing. James looked at him with the flat, empty stare he had learned in combat. The stare that said he had seen things that Holloway could not imagine and was not afraid of anything the private might do. He told Holloway that he was doing his job. He told him that the prisoner was injured and required medical attention. He told him that if Holloway had a problem with that, he could take it up with the captain. Then he turned his back on Holloway and helped the woman toward the medical tent. Behind him, he could hear the murmur running through the compound, prisoner and guard alike, as they watched an American medic carry a German woman to safety. He did not look back. Her name was Marlene Richter, and she had been a nurse in the German army for 3 years. James learned this over the following days, as he treated her injury, and she slowly began to trust him enough to speak. Her leg had been broken during an Allied bombing raid 6 weeks earlier, and it had healed badly because there had been no proper medical care available. The bone had set at a slight angle, causing the limp that James had witnessed, and there was an infection in the tissue around the old break that had been slowly spreading. Without treatment, the infection would eventually reach her blood and kill her. James explained this to her on the second day, after he had examined the leg more thoroughly and confirmed his initial suspicions. He explained it calmly, factually, the way his father would have explained a diagnosis to a customer at the pharmacy. Marlene listened without expression. When he was finished, she asked him a question that he had not expected. She asked him why he cared. James did not have a ready answer. He sat in silence for a moment, thinking about her question, thinking about Holloway and Captain Morrison, and all the soldiers who would happily let this woman die because she was German and therefore not worthy of help. He told her that he was a medic. He told her that his job was to help people who were hurt, regardless of what uniform they wore. He told her that his father had taught him that medicine was about helping people who needed help, not about deciding who deserved it. Marlene looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to believe in simple kindness anymore. She told him that he was either a fool or a saint, and she was not sure which was worse. James almost smiled. He told her that his father would probably agree with that assessment. The treatment of Marlene's leg required resources that the camp did not have. James needed antibiotics, proper surgical tools, and time to operate without being interrupted by the daily chaos of running a POW facility. He went to Captain Morrison and requested the supplies. Morrison refused. The captain explained, in the patronizing tone of a man who believed himself to be reasonable, that medical supplies were limited and needed to be conserved for American soldiers. He explained that German prisoners were entitled to basic care under the Geneva Convention, but that major surgeries were not required. He explained that if the woman's leg was infected, well, that was unfortunate, but it was not the American Army's responsibility to save every German who had been foolish enough to fight on the wrong side. James stood at attention and listened to the captain's explanation without changing expression. When Morrison was finished, James asked permission to speak freely. Morrison, perhaps sensing that something interesting was about to happen, granted it. James told him that the woman was going to die without treatment. He told him that allowing her to die when treatment was available would be a violation of the principles that America was supposed to stand for. He told him that the men in this camp were watching how the officers behaved, and that their behavior would shape how those men acted for the rest of their lives. He told him that doing the right thing was never about convenience. Morrison's face went red. He told James that he was dangerously close to insubordination. He told him that the decision had been made and would not be changed. He told him that if James wanted to waste his time treating German prisoners, he could do it with the supplies already allocated and not one aspirin more. Then he dismissed James from his office. James walked out into the grey afternoon light and stood for a long moment, looking at the camp around him, the barbed wire, the mud, the guards who seemed more interested in tormenting the prisoners than in maintaining order, the prisoners who moved with the shuffling gait of people who had given up hope. And somewhere in the medical tent, a woman named Marlene Richter was lying on a cot, waiting to find out whether she would live or die. James made a decision. He would find another way. The medical supply depot was 3 miles from the camp, a converted warehouse where equipment and medications were stored before being distributed to units throughout the region. It was guarded, but not heavily. The war was almost over, and no one expected any trouble this far behind the lines. James knew the location because he had requisitioned supplies from there before. He knew the guard rotation because he had made friends with one of the soldiers assigned to the depot, a sergeant from Ohio who had lost a brother on Omaha Beach, and appreciated anyone who treated wounded men with respect. He also knew that what he was planning could end his military career and possibly land him in prison. He did it anyway. The night of May 5th was cold and wet, with a thin rain falling that turned the roads to mud and reduced visibility to almost nothing. James told the guard at the camp gate that he was going to check on a sick prisoner at the auxiliary facility 2 miles north. The guard, half asleep and uninterested, waved him through without checking his story. James walked through the darkness toward the depot. He had thought carefully about what he needed: penicillin, which had only become widely available in the last year of the war and was still strictly rationed, surgical instruments for cleaning and resetting the bone, bandages, antiseptic, morphine for the pain. He had also thought carefully about how to get these things without being caught. The sergeant from Ohio was on duty that night. James had sent him a message earlier, asking to meet, and the sergeant had agreed without asking why. When James arrived at the depot, the sergeant was waiting outside, smoking a cigarette beneath the narrow overhang of the warehouse roof. James told him what he needed. The sergeant listened without interrupting. When James was finished, he took a long drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly, the smoke disappearing into the rain. He asked James if he understood what he was asking. James said that he did. The sergeant was quiet for a long moment. Then he told James about his brother, about how his brother had been hit on the beach and had lain in the water for 6 hours before a medic got to him, about how the medic had risked his own life to drag him to safety, had worked on him for 20 minutes while bullets flew overhead, had held his hand and told him he was going to be okay. His brother had died anyway, but the medic had tried. He had done everything possible, not because the brother was important or powerful or connected, but simply because he was a wounded man who needed help. The sergeant told James that his brother would have wanted him to do this. He led James into the warehouse and helped him gather the supplies he needed. They loaded everything into a canvas bag that James could carry over his shoulder, and they stood for a moment in the darkness, two soldiers bound together by an act that could destroy them both. The sergeant told James to be careful. James told him that he would. Then he walked back through the rain toward the camp, carrying enough medical supplies to save a German woman's life, and he did not let himself think about what would happen if he was caught. The surgery took 4 hours. James performed it in the middle of the night in the medical tent, with only a single lantern for light. He had sent his assistant, a young private who asked too many questions, on an errand that would keep him occupied until morning. He had bribed the guard on duty at the women's section with a pack of cigarettes to look the other way, and he had told Marlene that he was going to fix her leg. She had looked at him with that same disbelieving expression she had worn on the first day, when he had knelt beside her in the mud. She asked him why he was doing this. She asked him what he expected in return. She asked him if he understood that she was German, that she had served in the army that had killed his friends, that she had no way to repay him and nothing to offer. James told her that he did not expect anything in return. He told her that he was doing this because it was the right thing to do, and because his father had taught him that the measure of a man was not what he took from the world, but what he gave. Marlene looked at him for a long moment. Then she lay back on the cot and closed her eyes, and she trusted him to save her life. The operation was difficult. James had performed surgeries before, emergency procedures on battlefields and in ruined buildings, but nothing quite like this. He had to re-break the bone that had healed incorrectly, clean out the infected tissue, and set everything properly before closing the wound. Marlene was unconscious for most of it, sedated by the morphine that James had stolen from the depot. But at one point, near the end, she opened her eyes and looked at him. She did not say anything. She did not need to. James finished the surgery, bandaged the leg, and gave her another dose of morphine to help her sleep through the night. Then he cleaned his instruments, disposed of the bloody bandages, and sat down on a crate in the corner of the tent to wait for dawn. He was exhausted. His hands were shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline, and he knew that what he had done would not stay secret for long. Captain Morrison found out the next morning. One of the guards had noticed James coming back to camp in the early hours of the morning, wet and carrying a bag that he had not left with. The guard had reported it to his sergeant, and the sergeant had reported it to the captain. Morrison summoned James to his office. The captain was furious. His face was red, his hands were trembling, and his voice cracked with the particular anger of a man who has been defied by someone he considered beneath him. He accused James of theft. He accused him of insubordination. He accused him of wasting valuable medical supplies on an enemy combatant. He told James that he was going to be court-martialed, that his military career was over, that he would spend the next 10 years in a military prison. James stood at attention and said nothing. Morrison demanded to know if James had anything to say in his defense. James told him that the woman would have died without treatment. He told him that as a medic, he had a duty to provide care to anyone who needed it. He told him that the Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, and that allowing someone to die from a treatable infection was not humane. Morrison told him that he did not care about the Geneva Convention. He told him that Germans were the enemy, that they had started this war, that they had killed millions of innocent people. He told him that James was a traitor to his country for helping one of them. James asked Morrison if he had ever been to a concentration camp. Morrison's face went pale. James told him that he had. He told him about Ordruf, about the bodies stacked like cordwood, about the smell that he could still taste in the back of his throat. He told him that he had seen what happened when people decided that other human beings were not worthy of compassion, and that he had sworn to himself that he would never become like that. He told Morrison that he would rather go to prison than let a woman die because she was born in the wrong country. Morrison stared at him for a long moment. Then he ordered James to get out of his sight. The court-martial never happened. What happened instead was something that neither James nor Morrison had anticipated. Word spread through the camp like fire through dry grass. The American medic who had stolen supplies to save a German woman. The confrontation with Captain Morrison. The threat of court-martial. By noon of the day after the surgery, everyone knew. And then something remarkable began to happen. It started with the other medics in James's unit. They came to him one by one, quietly, when no officers were watching. They told him that they supported him. They told him that he had done the right thing. They told him that if Morrison tried to court-martial him, they would testify in his defense. Then it spread to the regular soldiers, men who had seen combat, men who had killed Germans and watched their friends die at German hands, came to James and shook his hand. They did not all agree with what he had done. Some of them thought he was crazy or naive or dangerously soft, but they respected him for having the courage to stand up for what he believed, even when it meant risking everything. The prisoners noticed, too. Marlene's recovery was slow but visible. Each day, she was able to put a little more weight on her leg. Each day, she walked a little farther. And each day, the other German prisoners watched. They began to treat James differently. The wariness in their eyes softened into something that might have been gratitude. When he walked through the compound, they nodded to him. When he came to the medical tent, they did not flinch. One morning, an older German soldier approached James and spoke to him in halting English. The soldier told James that he had served in the Wehrmacht for 4 years. He told him that he had killed American soldiers in battle and had expected to be treated with brutality when he was captured. He told him that he had lost faith in humanity somewhere in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He told James that watching him help Marlene had restored something that he thought was gone forever. James did not know what to say. He mumbled something about just doing his job. The soldier shook his head. He told James that it was more than that. He told him that mercy was the rarest thing in war, and that when it appeared, it shone like a light in darkness. Then he walked away, and James stood in the mud and felt something shift inside him. The real reckoning came 3 days later. A colonel from division headquarters arrived at the camp for an inspection. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that the colonel specifically asked to speak with Corporal James Whitmore. James expected to be arrested. He expected to be transferred, demoted, punished in some way that Morrison had arranged. Instead, the colonel asked him to explain what had happened. James told him the truth. All of it. The woman in the mud, the refused request, the raid on the supply depot, the surgery, the confrontation with Morrison. The colonel listened without interruption. When James was finished, the colonel told him that he had received 17 letters in the past 2 days. Letters from soldiers in the camp, describing what James had done and asking that he not be punished. Letters from medics, from infantrymen, from NCOs who had never written to their commanding officers before. The colonel told James that in his 30 years of military service, he had never seen anything like it. He told James that Captain Morrison was being transferred to a desk job in France, effective immediately. He told James that the incident was being recorded in his file, but not as a disciplinary matter. It was being recorded as an example of the kind of conduct that the United States Army expected from its soldiers. He told James that he was being promoted to sergeant. James stood in the colonel's makeshift office, stunned into silence. The colonel smiled. He told James that his father must be very proud of him. James thought about Robert Whitmore, standing behind his pharmacy counter, handing medicine to people who could not pay. He thought about the lesson his father had tried to teach him, about helping people who needed help, about doing the right thing, even when it was not convenient. He thought about Marlene Richter, lying in the medical tent with a leg that would heal properly now, who would walk without pain for the rest of her life, because one American soldier had refused to let her die. He told the colonel that he hoped so. The war ended 6 days later, on May 8, 1945. James stayed at the camp for another month, overseeing the processing and release of prisoners as the machinery of peace slowly ground into motion. He saw Marlene regularly, checking on her recovery, and they spoke more freely as the days passed, and the walls between enemy and ally began to crumble. She told him about her life before the war, about growing up in a small village near Munich, about studying nursing because she wanted to help people, about the day she received her conscription notice and understood that she had no choice but to serve. She told him that she had hated the Nazis, had hated what they did to her country and her people, but that hatred did not protect you from the machine once it started moving. She had done what she was told because the alternative was death. James listened without judgment. He had learned over the past year that the line between victim and perpetrator was not as clear as the newsreel suggested. Good people did terrible things when they were afraid. Ordinary people became monsters when the world around them told them it was acceptable. And sometimes, in the midst of all that darkness, someone chose to be kind anyway. On the day Marlene was released from the camp, she came to the medical tent to say goodbye. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at James with eyes that were no longer hollow, that held something in them that had not been there before. She told him that she did not know how to thank him. She told him that he had saved her life, not just her leg, but her life, and that she would never forget what he had done. James told her that she did not need to thank him. He told her that he had just done his job. Marlene shook her head. She told him that it was more than that. She told him that in a war full of cruelty and hatred, he had shown her that kindness still existed. She told him that she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life, and that she would try to pass it on to others. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a silver medallion, tarnished and scratched, with an image of St. Barbara on one side, the patron saint of nurses. Marlene told James that her mother had given it to her when she graduated from nursing school. She told him that she had worn it every day of the war, that it had protected her through bombings and battles and the long march into captivity. She told him that she wanted him to have it. James tried to refuse. He told her that he couldn't take something so personal. Marlene pressed it into his hand. She told him that she did not need protection anymore. She told him that because of him, she had faith again, faith in people, faith in the future, faith in the possibility of a world where enemies could become friends. She told him that the medallion belonged with him now. James looked down at the small piece of silver in his palm. He felt its weight, felt the history contained in its scratches and dents, felt the connection to a woman who had been his enemy and was now something else entirely. He closed his fingers around it. James Whitmore came home to Iowa in the autumn of 1945. He finished his pharmacy degree, married a woman named Susan, whom he had known since childhood, and took over his father's store when Robert retired in 1952. He kept the medallion in his pocket every day for the rest of his life. People in Cedar Falls knew him as the quiet pharmacist, the man who always had time to listen, who never turned anyone away regardless of their ability to pay. They did not know about the war, about Marlene, about the night he had stolen medical supplies to save a German woman's life. James did not talk about it, not because he was ashamed, but because he did not know how to explain that the most important thing he had ever done was also the simplest. He had seen someone suffering and he had helped. In 1978, 33 years after the war ended, James received a letter from Germany. It was from Marlene. She had tracked him down through military records, through the network of former POWs who kept in touch despite the decades and the distance. She wrote to tell him that she had rebuilt her life, that she had married, had children, had grandchildren, that she had become a nursing instructor and had taught hundreds of young people the skills they needed to care for the sick and the wounded. She wrote to tell him that she told all of her students about the American soldier who had saved her life, about how he had knelt beside her in the mud when everyone else walked past, about how he had risked his career to give her the treatment she needed, about how he had shown her that humanity could survive even in the midst of war. She wrote to tell him that her students had passed the story on to their students, and that somewhere in Germany there were young nurses who knew about James Whitmore and tried to live up to his example. She wrote to tell him that she had never forgotten. James sat in his pharmacy, holding the letter in his hands, and he thought about the boy from Iowa, who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, who had learned to be a medic in the chaos of Europe, who had stood in the mud of a POW camp and made a choice that seemed small at the time, but had rippled outward through decades and continents. He thought about his father's words, about helping people who needed help, about doing the right thing because it was right. He thought about the medallion in his pocket, warm from his body heat, a connection to a woman he had seen only a handful of times, but who had changed the course of his life. And he understood, finally, what his father had been trying to teach him all along. That kindness is never wasted, that compassion is never weakness. That the measure of a person is not found in the grand gestures that make the history books, but in the small moments when no one is watching, when it would be easier to look away, when helping someone costs you something. James Whitmore died in 1998 at the age of 78. His children found the medallion in his pocket when they dressed him for the funeral, and they wondered about its history. His son found Marlene's letters in a box in the attic, tied together with a piece of string. They read them together, James's children and grandchildren, sitting in the living room of the house where he had been raised. They learned about the woman in the mud, about the surgery in the night, about the letters that had saved him from court-martial, and the colonel who had promoted him instead. They learned about a man they thought they knew, and they discovered that he had been carrying a secret with him for half a century. Not a secret of shame, a secret of grace. The family donated the medallion to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it sits in a display case with a small placard explaining its history. The placard does not tell the whole story. It cannot. Some stories are too large for plaques and displays, too complicated for simple summaries. But anyone who stops to read it learns about a US soldier who saw a German woman limping and decided to help. And anyone who stops to think about it understands that sometimes the things that shake the world are not battles or treaties or the decisions of great men. Sometimes they are just one person kneeling in the mud, reaching out a hand. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share in the comments what moved you most, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. These stories remind us that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness can change everything. Help us keep these memories alive by sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.